Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX 2017, presents INTERPHEX Live.
So, hi, it's a new year, new events. We got a brand new INTERPHEX coming up for 2017, March 21st through the 23rd at the Javits Center. I'm here with Gil Roth. We're going to be talking about where we see going ahead here for over the next few years. A lot of new things, new year, new show, new administration. Yeah, almost forgot that one. And where do we see that going? I think what do we see being our challenges? I think, quite honestly, Gil, it's going to be the usual. It's going to be cost containment. One of the things we've heard a lot about over the last year or so is, hey, how come it's not made in America? I think we need to think about that. But I think the one that I find particularly interesting is how do we get and enable startups? How do we get the guys with the small compounds or the small companies? How do we get them to be players and get their products out there? I think that's going to be a big one. And where are those enablers and all that? So let's look at it from a general standpoint. Where are you seeing us going over the next 4 years? And then we can start looking at more specifics. How's that sound?
Very good. The CMO industry in particular, where I cover and what my trade association represents, is really seeing an opportunity for growth in the pharma and biopharma sphere, or the ecosystem that we're facing. Certainly with a new administration and a new Congress, there are going to be a lot of changes of parameters and different understandings of what manufacturing is, what outsourcing is for pharma versus other industries, and what the key drivers are and how pharma can benefit moving forward. I think when you talk particularly about startup culture, and it's key to what the CMOs help provide and what healthcare innovation is in America. We know that we're the drivers of the pharma industry worldwide, that America really is ahead of the game in terms of innovation and drug development and manufacturing. Where CMOs, I think, come in addition to being able to handle commercial manufacturing for products as they move through their life cycle, they also work much more on the development side in this day and age, and are able to empower startup companies to keep from having to make their own investment in major capital, to not have to build their own facilities, to build their own manufacturing technologies or clinical trial hubs, when CDMOs, the contract development and manufacturing organizations, can help take that role for them.
I fully agree with that. I mean, in our business, we find that many fellows that have only access to a new compound but no capital, or they're shopping around at the VCs, the answer usually is the enabler in this case is the CMO. It's the most flexible, they work with them, and most importantly, I think they can structure a supply chain that doesn't tie the startup guys to millions of dollars in stainless steel hardware. And I think that's absolutely key. So I think what we're saying is, the CMO seems to be an enabler, and the CMO is the fellow who the technology is going to reside in. Where do you see that technology right now? If they're going to be the enablers, they must be in the front on the technology sides.
Certainly.
Where are we at?
And it varies across the chain or the whole ecosystem of CMOs, but the ones that are more advanced, I'll tell you a story. We, with the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association, have built very strong relations with FDA over the past several years. One aspect of which culminated in a meeting with Janet Woodcock, the head of CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where we sat down with her to talk about the role of CMOs, how we can work better with FDA, things that we can help FDA with. And one of the key areas for that was advanced manufacturing technologies, particularly continuous manufacturing, which I know is an area of significant interest to FDA. We were able to convey to the agency, to Dr. Woodcock and her team, that CMOs are in a position where they can advance that technology, they can educate the agency about the particular aspects of manufacturing as a platform, as opposed to how they tie into a specific NDA or BLA. They're, in a sense, product agnostic. The companies that are advancing this sort of technology can train the agency in inspection. They can show them what needs to be done, what a sign of a good process is versus bad, but they're not tying it into this particular new drug application by any means. So in that respect, I think CMOs are in a position to work more effectively with FDA and to help them try to bring this new technology to the fore and into the commercial landscape.
That's a great idea, Gil. I mean, there was several initiatives that were taken on by FDA that was shared with industry. SUPAC was a classic, okay? And now we know how successful that was. So the CMOs and continuous manufacturing and growing that technology, I know is very hot. Our live sessions in March 21st through the 23rd there, we have at least 4 that we're going to be talking about the specifics of continuous process. But let me ask you this. So it's not at the CMO, where's the enablers coming from? So we have CMOs, is it, and we have folks that own or are developing continuous process. Those are the enablers. Who are these startups? Are these universities? Are they one-man shows? What has been your experience on that?
I think a lot of them are the smaller and virtual startups. They're really coming out of university culture generally. Mm-hmm. Some of them do come out of the great culling of pharma and biopharma in recent years, where the large pharma companies are pairing off research programs. Some of the former employees at those companies see promise in certain molecules. Maybe mega pharma company X doesn't see it the same way. They're willing to sell off the molecule to these smaller startup companies. And those companies work to build an infrastructure to be able to develop the molecule, sometimes with an option to sell it back to the parent company that they initially bought it from. But we're seeing it, like I said, from university, from incubator startup culture, as well as these spin-outs from pharma itself.
So, yeah, okay, I see that. My experience has been a lot of times it's a group of fellas that one of their termination or separation agreements was they got access to a particular compound. Okay, so that's pretty much it. What we found on the continuous process, Rutgers University, Dr. Unzio, he will be one of our speakers. They're going to talk about their collaboration with FDA and I would suspect the collaboration with the other CMOs. So I think that's something really to be thinking about. Continuous process. So people often say, okay, so continuous process, big deal. You turn it. So my point is, if it's continuous and it's tunable, it's about cost containment. And that, I think, when people shop or the people go to CMOs, it's all about cost containment or cost of goods, which is another hot topic. Always is a hot topic, sure. But in a new year and a new everything else, it's even hotter. So maybe, what is our take on that? Obviously, what do you see from your side? Where's the pressure on that?
From my previous incarnation, before I launched this trade association, I was the editor at Contract Pharma magazine from 1999 to 2014. And during that time, we would run a outsourcing survey every spring. I think Contract Pharma's new one is coming up in another month or two. And in the early years of the magazine, cost tended to be the #1 consideration by the customer side. And in recent years, it's really declined in favor of quality, deliverables, timeliness, things that might be a little bit of a synonym for each other, but certainly quality is #1 now with contract manufacturer choices. Cost is important, but at the same time, there's a degree to which cost of goods sold matters, but making sure you actually have the drug and have it produced in a quality manner, have it produced in the right quantities, remains #1. So there are multiple drivers where it comes to CMO selection. It's interesting to see how they've reconciled somewhat to cost not being the absolute driver. If anything, it's part of the point we've tried to make with Congress and the new administration, that outsourcing in the pharma and biopharma sphere is not the same as outsourcing in some other consumer chains, where it's really driven by trying to find the cheapest labor force possible, or where you're going to get the best tax advantage for a manufacturing issue. With pharma, outsourcing is much more tied into specific expertise, sometimes geographic regions. Cost is definitely a factor, but not in the sense of trying to drive unit costs down to nothing, so much as how best to allocate capital overall.
I think you bring up a great point. Again, being a 40-plus year veteran myself of the industry, it's not a shock to understand that a lot of the technology that we use did not come from our development here in the States, but from Europe, from various other countries. I think expertise and ability and the ability to make has to be separated, and I'm glad we talked about it, from the commodity part. It's not about commodity or tax saving. A lot of times, if we're looking for a unique platform for our product, it will require us to go where it's developed. From a regulatory standpoint, you and I both know if you're developing a unique dosage form in a unique area in a place, moving it geographically is a challenge. I mean, you want to comment on that? I mean,
well, certainly it was. Well, in the movement of let's bring everything back to America, in terms of pharmaceutical manufacturing, it's a very difficult prospect because tech transfer can take 2 years for a single product and can cost significant amounts of money to do it right. It's not one of those things where it takes time and costs money because there's unnecessary regulation. It's the case that you need to make sure these are being done correctly, being done in a safe and sterile environment in a lot of these cases. So the idea of manufacturing, well, of moving all this manufacturing from one place to another is not necessarily practical, I suppose. It is another area that I should have brought up when I mentioned key drivers for outsourcing decisions is IP protection, and that explains why certain regions are more favored than others for outsourcing. There are places you can do dosage form manufacturing that you can trust your partners and trust the administrations and region around you. And there are a lot of factors that go into making that outsourcing decision ultimately.
Yeah, Gil, it's a wealth of information you've shared here. I think from my own experience, having worked with a lot of the global partners in my time spent with a global company, we try to place things in an environment from a regulatory standpoint that gives us the most flexibility, and that means addressing the globalization of the product. In a lot of cases, that's not necessarily a domestic issue. It becomes more of a global issue. And where can we approach the rest of the world from that distribution point? Right. I think you have to really get beyond the made in America idea, which is, that's apple pie and the American way. But I think in specific industries, you have to understand that regionalization and where it's made is driven by many, many things and not simply the geographic location.
Sure, and there are some that have their own local production. If anything, this is why once the EU really came together, we saw pharma divesting so many facilities, because previously they had to have a facility in country X, Y, and Z in order to be able to sell into those countries. With the merging of the EU, it became an issue where a lot of those facilities were superfluous, and that actually led to a profusion of contract manufacturers as facilities came on the market at relatively low prices with trailing supply agreements. We still see it now. There was a piece in Outsourcing Pharma very recently about a Saudi-based CDMO that's looking to partner, at least to do final or secondary packaging for some products in order to essentially certify those products for sale in Saudi Arabia. So that's still a factor when it comes to manufacturing both in and outside the U.S. You have to take into account where it's going to be sold, what the markets are for certain products.
I couldn't agree more. I think the other thing that has to be made clear is if you are seeking a specialized platform, it becomes not only the region, it becomes the equipment, it becomes the facility itself is built around that specialized platform.
Sure.
Or can you share anything on CMOs that have specialized platforms? Or?
I don't want to name anybody by name because I'm sure I'll forget someone who'll be mad at me after.
Absolutely, you can guarantee that.
Yeah, so, but it is, I think, a trend that we've seen, again, with my about 18 years in the industry now. Previously, growth in the early days of, say, contract pharma, first part of the last decade, expansion within the CMO sector was largely driven by geographic plays. You're buying facilities here, there, and other places in order to expand your reach, get certain scale. And in recent years, that's really slowed down in favor of acquiring companies with particular technologies and making sure that you get, say, hot melt extrusion or other types of manufacturing processes that will help advance developing molecules and things that are moving forward. We just saw recently with Asahi Glass Company buying CMC Biologics in order to enhance its ability to do antibody drug conjugates as a contract manufacturer. CMC had good operations by itself, but being able to wed that into the existing offerings for AGC means that they have a much more integrated technology play.
I think that's a piece that that none of us. When you're embracing is probably a bad word. When you're engrossed in the industry,
Yeah.
it's intuitive to us.
Right.
I think our conversation, what we're trying to say is, let's think about this a minute. Yeah, we're looking ahead. We want to see how things evolve. But I think because of the nature of our regulations, we're kind of anchored into some of the things in the past. If our NDA was just approved, that's something that we're going to be married to for quite a while. And you and I both know making changes to these things.
You mentioned
is difficult.
SUPAC, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why CMOs can help drive continuous manufacturing and new processes in a way that in-house pharma wouldn't necessarily be able to do or willing to do. For the in-house pharma company that owns its NDA, making a significant change in the manufacturing process is a excruciating matter. For a CMO that can show that it can accommodate this type of manufacturing across multiple NDAs, that cost can be reduced. It can develop the expertise and get new drugs that are being worked on into those sorts of manufacturing platforms, whereas a major pharma might not invest in those to begin with because it's not going to favor their existing products, and they're not going to they're not going to change the whole CMC package for their products in favor of some new technology that might save them a bit, but might also lead to long delays in approvals.
So to me, one of the things we always talk about is how easy if I had to. So a lot of the firms, big firms, they usually like to think of their processes somewhat modular or portable. And we're going to talk about portable and modular, obviously, at the show in March, but that seems to be more hardware. Essentially, if you design a process and keep it in a modular form, you can essentially pick it up, move it, get around some of the regulations, and drop it into a facility somewhere else.
In theory.
So,
yeah.
Well, what is your take on that? Where do CMOs going to be?
Well, CMOs are generally good with being adaptable, as long as you're identifying ones that could accommodate this sort of modular process. It's still the steps of, particularly with FDA, making sure that they're on board with this sort of tech transfer, they're on board with the type of facility. In a lot of cases, it's simply them making a risk assessment of a new facility, whether that facility has made this type of drug previously, helps them decide on the agency level whether they need to do a pre-approval inspection, or if you're looking at SUPAC, if you need to move and change something significant. It's something we certainly saw. It was eye-opening for us during the generic drug negotiations we were involved in with FDA, was the complexity of the inspection landscape for the agency and what they have to do to be able to especially inspect overseas, which is still, it's something we negotiated to try to achieve parity with domestic versus non-US facility inspections. But a recent GAO report showed that there's still a significant number of pharma manufacturing facilities that FDA has actually never visited, and it's not something they're proud of, and they're working to make sure to fill in those gaps. But we really learned during the negotiations how difficult it can be to get to some of these sites, and how if you inspect once and there's a problem, getting back there the second time also can become quite a hurdle.
And kind of plays back to that theme we talked about, that once you have something in place and it's under control,
it's an incentive to keep it there.
Yeah, it's really a high incentive, because we're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, another inspection, that means government expenses for them, private industry expenses. So it seems to me that simply moving something has inherent a high cost.
Yes, and high risk.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing. And if there's something wrong and it's going to take 6 months for remediation and then for the agency to come in and then to close it out, that's, then you better keep manufacturing in the other facility for quite a while. And if you've already told them you're leaving, it can become culturally difficult. It can become a difficult business model. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons for inertia, I suppose, in terms of selecting a manufacturer who works well with you and sticking with them.
Yeah, my rule of thumb is if it's going to go wrong, it usually goes wrong at tech transfer.
Yeah, that tends to hold up across the industry.
That's where the rubber meets the road. Yeah. speaking of tech transfer and process, just out of curiosity, I mean, we have a tendency to talk about continuous, and we have a tendency to talk about modular. And I think it's important, at least for an old solids guy like myself, that we, I think we need to just be a little more open with broader with the discussion. One of the things we've seen is modular from the bio side, modular single use, and why don't we, from your standpoint, the CMOs have embraced all this as well, or?
From the biologics end, certainly. I'm not as versed in terms of the oral solids, in terms of how the technologies are really advancing and being adopted by some of these companies. On the biologics end, though, yeah, if you're entering this space or you've entered in recent years as a CMO, you're going to be working. I am assuming you're going to be working from a single-use system platform. It really has reduced the barriers to entry within that space. Yeah, obviously, the importance of sterility and everything else in terms of validation is there, but the need to import or to bring in 25,000-liter stainless steel tanks, that doesn't exist anymore. There's only a few companies that are still there, and they were the ones that were there 10, 15 years ago.
So Gil, I mean, I think the point, I appreciate what you're saying. I mean, one of the things that there was always a finite capacity for biologics manufacture in the United States.
Sure.
We don't hear that bandied about anymore, and I think a lot of that's because of the single use and the flexible.
There's still, it still comes up, but in terms of there isn't, if you needed 25,000 liters, yeah, that capacity is still not there. But if you're looking for these smaller, in some respects, it's been due to the fact that drugs that are being developed tend to be for smaller patient populations, and that the yields from biologic processes have improved greatly, so that a 2,000-liter single-use system might essentially replace what used to be done in 10, 12, 15,000-liter setup, because you're not trying to reach as many patients and you're actually getting more grams, more milliliters of product out of your processes.
So that's really, because that's one of the other things that we hear a lot about at the show. I mean, the things that are always hot topics, the biosimilars, the yields, but one of the things that we've seen of late is the process intensification. So, I mean, I take that to mean that per liter I can up my drug yield. I mean,
that tends to be it, yeah. That seems to be the way things have gone in the last 10, 15 years. That certainly the yields have improved, and that means you don't need the same manufacturing infrastructure you once did. And we see it in some respects. As I mentioned, there are still the two main companies that are providing massive scale for these things, Lonza and Boehringer Ingelheim. And Lonza very recently made a play to move into the non-biologic CMO space by buying Capsugel. So they are seeing opportunities within CMO that aren't necessarily biologics focused. So we'll see if that plays out throughout the industry further.
That's an interesting, I mean, the Capsugel story, I mean, we've seen that's taken several routes.
Yeah,
over the
yeah,
last
that's been a
few
very
years.
circuitous process to get to where they are now.
Okay, yeah. Well, considering I don't recall half of the twists and turns on that one, we won't go there. But I think one of the other things that I think we need to look at is, what is, in your organization, does academia come into play? I mean,
we've looked at building partnerships, and Rutgers, in fact, is one of the groups we want to work with to help develop best practices for certain types of manufacturing, to get companies talking and figure out how they can implement certain types of manufacturing processes in their own CMO systems. We're also interested, I haven't followed up yet, but I saw in recent weeks, National Institute of Biopharmaceutical Manufacturing that seems to be devoted to advancing science and technology for manufacturing processes for both pharma and biopharma, not simply the biologics end. And we would love to get involved with them and see how our contract manufacturers can share information with them and learn in the process.
I just, out of curiosity, one of the things that while we're on the academic, I've seen in several cases, and I'm sure you know this better than I, some CMOs / contractors actually are a spin-off from universities. That seems to be very successful.
Yeah, I believe, and they'll shoot me if I'm wrong on this, but Coldstream Laboratories, which was acquired recently by Piramal Pharma Solutions, actually spun out of University of Kentucky. And I think we've seen that with several others, that there's generally they build out as a development side CMO, and as they bring a couple of clients further towards commercialization, they might be looking at adding commercial capabilities. But yeah, there's the expertise is there. Manufacturing processes can be developed in a sort of incubator format out of a university and then turned into a standalone CMO. It's obviously not going to be Catalent level at the outset, but these companies can work and start building business on their own and be able to feed off of the local university ecosystem that they're in.
Did the build-outs sometimes take place on campuses? Or?
I think in Coldstream's case it did. I think it was actually University of Kentucky land that they were building the facility on and subsequently acquired. But yeah, it's. I think they can do that, but I'm not too versed.
Okay.
And
No,
again,
I'm not trying to put you on, but it seemed like that's a win for many aspects. That's pretty good. So I think one of the points that, I think what we try to come around to is, we talked about the cost piece, we talked about the entrepreneur and the enabler. So I am a spin-off from a company. What scenario over the next 4 years? I want to, I have a new compound. Let's say it's rather critical, right? And it's something I want to grow. What scenario do you see if I was the entrepreneur? What would your recommendations be?
Well, the obvious thing is go to INTERPHEX.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
But it is important to be able to find the CMOs that are appropriate for what you're trying to produce. And it was always a challenge in the magazine days that we were trying to make sure we could connect not just the Pfizers, Mercks, and Glaxos, but the smaller startups with the contract manufacturers and development service providers who could work with them. To that end, I do think certain trade shows are very, very useful for doing that. Sometimes it can be regional ones for a particular clinical trial manufacturer and services, but it's important to know what you're trying to achieve as a startup, or to trust your CMO to hold your hand and walk you through these processes, because a lot of times, well, I've heard stories from some of our members about a guy showing up with basically a beaker with some gel in it and saying, we need to make more of this, and they don't really have the processes and they really don't know what goes into it. So understanding what you have and how to produce it, and then trusting. Honestly, CMOs have taken over more of I would say the drug application process, not just from a CMC perspective, but especially when you get to the larger CMOs. They're really helping clients, both small and large, bring their drug applications throughout the entire process. They've really developed a great deal of expertise doing this. So that's an area beyond simply the manufacturing itself, but being able to do the regulatory and bring a product along. That's, I think, a great value added for the CMO sector.
And most CMOs have their own testing capabilities? Or?
I think a good deal of them, or they subcontract with someone they trust, and that's that's a very important relationship to have.
Right. Well, I think what we've heard, and to bring this round circle, is that it looks like networking and discussing, seeing the new technology, understanding it, learning about new technology, getting to meet our networking partners. Gil, for example, guys in the CMOs. Best place to do that will be at the Javits Center, March 21st through the 23rd. Hope to see everybody there, and make sure you don't miss the live sessions, where we'll be discussing a lot more of our topics in greater detail. Thanks a lot, Gil.
Thanks.